All men desire to know Aristotle's metaphysics. All actions seem to seek some good. Nicomachean Ethics. Hi, I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and in this video we're going to discuss the readings for this week's chapter in our Philosophy 200s class. Now, originally I'd planned for this week's video to be outside and be doing a bunch of really interesting things, but it's raining and cold right now in Kentucky, so we're doing it inside. Additionally, as you can see, my whiteboard has been replaced with a TV screen. This chapter covers a lot of topics all in one, and there was no way that I could fit the notes onto a whiteboard easily. So we're going to try this, and hopefully, we'll end up with a video that's even better than what I've been doing before. Last week, we covered divine command theory and natural law theory. Now, these theories of ethics do have their own ethical principles, but they also function as a type of meta-ethics, meaning that the theories in and of themselves explain how the ethical, how these ethical principles work. This week, we're moving into virtue ethics, which each branch of virtue ethics that we'll cover, and you can see we're going to cover 5 variations, has their own idea of where these ethical principles come from. Aquinas, who we saw in last week's lecture, he says that these ethical principles come from God via natural law, but Aristotle says something different, and the Buddhists, Confucians, and Taoists all say something different as well. When it comes to the foundation of these different ethical theories, each one's going to look a little bit different. Now, as far as this lecture in particular, I'm going to focus a lot more heavily on Aristotle than on the others. I will cover the others, but I'm going to focus a bit more on Aristotle. And the reason for that is our course interacts and talks a bit more about Aristotle than it does with the other theories. I'm going to give you all more background information and more knowledge on Aristotle to help you not only with this course, but with your future studies. Not to say that, Aquinas or the Buddhists or Confucians aren't worth studying in their own right. They absolutely are, but got to make tough choices, right? Otherwise, this video would be 9 hours long. So, starting with Aristotle, we'll see, was one of Plato's students and one of the greatest philosophers of all time in his own right. Aristotle, as he got older, he founded the Lyceum, which was a Greek school, and he was also one of the tutors of Alexander the Great. Little fun fact in there. Aristotle argues that ethics are a matter of science and that there's an objectively right way to live a human life. And the reason he says that is because his ethics build upon his metaphysics. So he has this metaphysics, which is this idea about why the world is the way that it is, and then his ethics build on top of that, right? So he's an essentialist. So what that means is that there are certain things that you have to have a good life, and he has an idea of what a good life includes, and that's a life of virtue and contemplation. So let's talk about some of the essential requirements for a good life. So Aristotle says you need to cover all your basic necessities. You got to be able to have water, food, a place to live. When you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, you got to fill up that base layer first, right? It's really hard to imagine someone having a very good and happy life if they're, in starvation, right? Next thing you need is you need some leisure time. I know in our modern culture, leisure time is seen as a bit odd. Our culture tells us that we need to work nonstop. We need to squeeze every ounce of productivity that we can out of the day. But for Aristotle, we need to focus on having some leisure time. You can't have a good life if you're just working constantly. You got to have your health, right? It's hard to imagine, at least Aristotle would say, and I know our modern view is a bit different, but Aristotle would say that you can't really have a good life if you don't have physical health, right? So someone who's, say, got a chronic disease and they're in constant pain, Aristotle would say that it would be very hard for them to have a good life. And then finally, you got to have friends, and friends are particularly important to Aristotle. According to him, it is, we're social creatures. We're a species that belongs in a tribe, and you can't have a good life if you're all alone. If you're just a lonely person, then you won't be able to live a good life. And we see that with modern psychology today, right? They do tons of surveys that find that people who, don't have friends, or people who are lonely all the time, experience really high levels of depression or suicidal tendencies, right? So friends are a necessary ingredient of that good life. And he describes three types of friends, right? So when we're thinking about how to live ethically and how to live morally, we got to think about all these different types of friends. The first friends are friends of pleasure, and there's two types of pleasure. This might be just like the mental, social pleasure of, someone's so fun to be around. It could be physical pleasure, you think of friends with benefits or that sort of thing. This is the most shallow type of friendship. These are the type of friends that maybe you're both in school together and you see each other in the hallways and you enjoy talking to this person because they're really fun, but you don't quite care much what happens outside of that. You're not staying up to date with their life. You're not a part of their deep social circle. The next type is friends of utility. Think of like fishing buddies, or maybe you've got a friend that's got a trampoline. You're friends with them as long as they have something that benefits you. I use the fishing buddies example. I know a lot of people, they're, fishing buddies or hunting buddies with someone, and as long as it's fishing season or hunting season, they're peas in a pod, but the rest of the year they don't really interact. And then finally is what Aristotle says is the best kind of friend, and that's friends of virtue. Virtuous friends. These are friends where you share all the same values, you share the same virtues. It's almost like you're two souls. These are friends that encourage you to live a good life, and they themselves are trying to live a good life. These are friends that want you to do good, and they themselves are trying to do good. Like a common example you might think of is people who are all going to seminary together, right? They're all going to be priests. They're all trying to be virtuous. They're all trying to live a good life. Maybe they're living in the dorms together, and they've got this virtuous friendship. Their lifelong friends come together. Another example might be military buddies, right? You all share this common core set of beliefs, this military core values, um, and that allows you to kind of bond together in a way that people outside of that might not be able to. So, talking a little bit about the three types of friends, like I said, Aristotle says that they're essential for having a good life. Um, which leads us, which is kind of a nice breaking point where we can talk a little bit about some background, some metaphysical concerns in relation to Aristotle. So, Aristotle, he went to Plato's school, but he didn't quite believe in Plato's forms. He didn't find that they had a strong enough justification for the forms. So, he came up with his own idea, which we call hylomorphism. Hule, matter, or accidental qualities. That's size, shape, color, location. That's all the things about a thing that come together to make it what it is. And then Morphe, that's the form, soul, substance, essence, right? You'll hear all these different words described, but that's all, that's the thing that makes it what it is. So you think about a cat. Um, what are the components of a cat? It's a mammal. It's got hair, unless it's a hairless cat, eyes, ears, a nose. It might be white. It might be black. It might be white and black. It might be striped. It might be orange, right? All those things are accidental qualities. But when those accidental qualities come together in a certain size, shape, and disposition, that creates the essence of a cat. That creates the catness of a cat, right? So Aristotle says that all things that exist have this sort of essence, right? You think of a table, it's got four legs, flat top, right? There's some essential components to be in a table. One of them is having a flat top. You don't have to have four legs to be a table. You could have a one-legged table, or you could have a table that's maybe balanced on top of an engine block or something, right? Um, but if it loses that flat top, then it's hard to say it's a table anymore. If you had a table that was full of big rippling waves, it would be hard to consider that a table. It might be a table in name, but it wouldn't be a table in essence, right? Because it wouldn't have that tableness. All things have matter, which I already discussed, but they can change, right? These material parts of things. So we use the example of a table. Let's say I've got a table, flat top, 4 legs, and I decide, you know what, I'm tired of this table. I want a chair, so I take it apart and then rebuild it as a chair. It still had all the material of when it was a table, but now it's got a different essence, right? It's a different type of thing. So enough changes to a thing will change what it is. So Aristotle believed that humans, much like everything else, we have this matter, we have this essence, right? So you think of all the parts of a human, we're mammals, we, are made of flesh, we, have hair and fingers and arms. An ideal human would have all the things that a human has. And when all these things come together, it creates humanness, right? If I, had a bunch of lizard scales or, devil horns, or if I was a bird, had big bird beak, it would be hard to say that I was a human at that point. I'd be something else, some other type of creature, right? But we have a function, and the function is for us to move towards a goal, and that's to reach our essence, right? The essence of a human being, Aristotle argued, is eudaimonia, or flourishing, right? Because we're a living thing. In the same way that a plant wants to grow towards the sun, a plant wants to get nutrition, and a plant wants to reproduce, human beings want to flourish as well, right? But we need more things in a plant, right? We need food, water, air, movement, reproduction, social interactions, um, contemplation, happiness, right? You got that whole hierarchy of needs, right? And our essence, our primary goal is to reach that eudaimonia. So Aristotle created his ethics kind of like a guidebook to help us, move towards that human flourishing, and to help us move towards, that good human life that we seek so much. And he believed, and this is something I believe as well, that morality is something that you got to practice at. It's not something, you don't just wake up and you're a good person. You have to work hard and build it into habit. You have to make all these efforts to advance yourself and improve yourself as a person. One of the ways we do that is by exercising prudence, which is acting in the right way at the right time, applying the appropriate virtue to the appropriate situation. But he names many universal situations that we need to navigate throughout our lives, and we have to find the mean between them, right? So that's our goal. We have to find the mean between two extremes and understand how to act. This is a long list, and it's going to seem a bit excessive, but you got to understand when Aristotle wrote Nicomachean Ethics, it was either lecture notes or, an early version of a textbook used for his students, right? So I'm going to go through each one of these different situations and the virtues and extremes that go in between them, and I'll discuss a little bit about them as we go through. So the first situation are situations of bravery. The deficiency of bravery is cowardice, the excess is recklessness, and the mean between them is smart courage. Now, one thing Aristotle says is that the appropriate virtue will sometimes lean more towards one than the other. And in situations of bravery, Aristotle would say that it would lean a little bit more towards the excess side than the deficiency. It would be more reckless than it would be cowardice. And the reason for that is when Aristotle talks about bravery, he has a very specific meaning in mind. He means specifically situations that involve physical conflict or danger to your life. So when you see on Facebook people talking about, say someone's a cancer survivor and they're so brave for surviving it, Aristotle wouldn't say that that's bravery because it's not a situation of physical danger, right? Their life is deteriorating because of a disease, but it's not a situation where someone is coming and attacking them, right? The next one is beastly pleasures. And beastly pleasures are anything that you can do with your body that makes you feel good. Um, the deficiency of that is insensible. The excess is self-indulgence. The mean between those is temperance, right? It's hard to imagine a good life where you aren't eating some food and where you aren't, um, enjoying some physical pleasures, right? It's very hard to imagine. I have a cat coming over, um, wanting to be petted right now. Is she in the shot? Yeah. So we're just going to keep on going with my little kitty buddy. Her name's Kitty. That's her name. It's Kitty. Um, so the next situation is situations of small giving. So I'm going to split these up. You got small giving and big giving, great honors and small honors. Um, Aristotle believed that certain people could not ever exercise situations of big giving. If you're not a rich person, you'll never have a situation where you can exercise big giving. In the same way of great honors, right? Some people are, at least according to Aristotle, some people are great people and they will get great honors, but not everyone is going to be a great person, right? So, starting with small giving, when you think about small giving, this might be, the person ringing the bell outside of the store at Christmas, right? Collecting for the red buckets. It might be a church collection plate. It might be any other situation where you're given some small amount. So the deficiency is miserliness, the excess is wastefulness, and the mean is generosity, right? So this is one of those where Aristotle says, we go more towards the excess than the deficiency. When it comes to small given, you might think, well, how can you ever be wasteful with small given? Well, eventually you'll hit a point of diminishing returns where you give up everything, but you're not really making that much of a difference after that. And you'll also run into situations where, if you could give up so much that you're not able to take care of yourself, in which case you're going to decrease the quality of your own life at the expense of another, right? Next is big given. So if you're someone who's very wealthy, think of your very rich people, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, whatever. Aristotle says this is a special virtue for them. The deficiency is stinginess, the excess is vulgarity, the mean is magnificence. And what does magnificence mean? It means building libraries, building great parks, building temples, doing great public displays, right? Because Aristotle's society, it was a capitalist society, much like ours, but with the difference being that, their currency wasn't a fiat currency and value wasn't traded in stocks and bonds. Their currency was gold and value was traded in gold. So if the rich were holding on to their money, if they weren't spending, then literally no one else had money, which leads to the next one, great honor. These great people who do these great things, we got to honor them. When they receive an honor, they need to be magnanimous about it, right? Because when people come together to honor someone, it's appropriate. It's a good thing to recognize that honor, right? The deficiency of it is pusillanimousness. It means turning away honors when they're given to you. The excess is vanity. This is someone that all they wants to do is, talk about themselves and talk about how great they are, right? So when someone is presented with a great honor, the appropriate thing is to accept it. Small honors, deficiency is lack of ambition, excess is over ambitiousness, the mean is controlled ambition, right? You need to accept these small honors. It's okay to want to get a small honor. Anger, in situations of anger, deficiency is insensibility. The excess is irascibility, and the mean is mildness. You want to be slow to anger. You don't want to just be flying off the handle all the time, right? So with this one, the mean is more close to the deficiency than to the excess. Friendliness. So the deficiency of friendliness is cantankerousness. The excess is ingratiation, and the mean is friendliness, right? You don't want to be so grumpy you scare your friends away, but you don't want to be a suck up. No one likes a suck up. So you got to find that nice mean in between them, right? Next is truth and boasting. So truth and boasting is actually related to the great honors in a way, right? The deficiency is an understated modesty, right? So you think about that. That's someone who maybe they do something really impressive. They, build a giant wall or something. And then you say, oh, well, you built this beautiful wall. And they say, oh, no, it wasn't me. It was the bricks, right? Well, when someone says that to you, you're like, huh? That's kind of weird, right? The excess is boastfulness, right? It's the same as not accepting the honors, right? It's basically a type of vanity, just talking about themselves, even if it's truthful. Someone tells you that they can read 200 words a minute, even if they can, even if it's true. I mean, do you really care, right? And then the mean is pleasant truthfulness. So that's being truthful, but also being pleasant about it. And then finally, wit. There's a time and place for wit. A good life does involve some humor, right? The deficiency is boorishness. The excess is buffoonery. And the mean is tactful wit. Think of Mark Twain, right? Sometimes he's making jokes, sometimes he's not. All right, so I know that section on the virtues was a lot. So, bear with me, right? It was a lot to cover talking about all these different situations. But the main thing with Aristotle that we want to remember is that being virtuous, being good, being moral takes practice. It's not something that comes naturally, right? It's a science and we have to work at it. We have to work at being moral in order to live a good life. So now we're going to roll on to our next section. Thomas Aquinas. We saw Thomas Aquinas a little bit in last week's lectures when we talked about natural law theory. And you got to remember, natural law theory, that was the meta-ethical basis for Aquinas's virtue ethics. So Aquinas took Aristotle and reinterpreted it through a Christian lens. And he says that sin affects our moral life, it affects how we act, but it doesn't affect our rational life. Even though we act improperly because we have a sinful nature, we can still think rationally and we can still know what is right and wrong, even if we act improperly. To be virtuous, we must learn the natural laws and learn to see God's design and purpose. And then we must practice the four cardinal virtues. Those are temperance, courage, prudence, and justice. So we see prudence making a return again from Aristotle. He kept that, and he kept temperance as well, right? He kept courage, kind of smart courage, right? But then he added justice, a virtue of justice, which is a little bit different from Aristotle. Aristotle does believe in justice and does think that people need to be just, but he breaks it off into its own category. So we talked a little bit about Aquinas. We kind of see some of this moral development from the time of Aristotle, the Greeks, all the way to the Europeans, which is Aquinas, medieval times. Let's check in on the other side of the world and see how the Buddhists were doing. So, starting in India around 5th century BC, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, and Buddha means enlightened one. So, Buddhism is one of the largest religions in the world now and is a very big religion back in the day, too. The goal for Buddhists is to be free from eternal suffering, which is life and the cycle of reincarnation, right? So, um, from a Buddhist perspective, nothing we do here in this life can really truly be good and pleasurable because the cycle of reincarnation and the cycle of this life is a cycle of suffering. So we want to break free from that and we want to reach nirvana, right? And we do that through meditation, prayer, fasting, charity, and virtue. But more specifically, there's a path, a regulated way in which we do these things, which the Buddhists themselves call the Eightfold Path. Um, Now, Chinese Buddhists will sometimes refer to this path, the Eightfold Path, as the Tao or the Tao, as the way, right? We got to remember in Chinese, Tao literally means the way. So we're going to hear that a lot. You're following the way, right? It's got 8 folds, which are sometimes called pillars, and they're broken down into ethical parts, wisdom parts, and meditative parts. So we'll start with the ethical parts. That's right action, right speech, right livelihood, intending to cause no harm, abstaining from harsh speech, and abstaining from work that harms others. So, for example, from a Buddhist perspective, you wouldn't want to be a soldier, you wouldn't want to say mean things to people, and you wouldn't want to harm people. Then we move on to the wisdom parts. That's right view. So the first part is you have to acknowledge the Four Noble Truths. You have to acknowledge suffering, which is that all life is suffering. You have to acknowledge the origin of suffering, which is human desires as well as the world itself. You have to understand that you can cease the suffering. You can learn to grow away from the suffering by abandoning your attachments and your aversions, becoming disconnected from the world. And you have to understand the truth of the path, which is that the path itself is the true way. You have to have right resolve as well, which is you have to believe these things and then you have to want to be free of suffering, right? It's not just enough to believe them, you have to want to be free of suffering. Then there are the meditative parts of the path, which is right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So we work for the good virtues. We understand happiness comes from being virtuous and that all non virtuous things will cause suffering. So if we don't act in a virtuous way, it will lead to suffering. We abandon our attachments and our aversions. And when when the Buddhists say abandoning attachments, to seek enlightenment, they mean all attachments, attachments to love, attachments to food, attachments to anything at all in this life. And then right concentration. So, when you're meditative, you have to be making sure you're avoiding counterproductive thoughts and you're focusing only on your meditations and you're focusing on being free from suffering. All the pillars, all the folds of the path work towards right concentration. And we saw right concentrations avoiding counterproductive thoughts. So all these other parts work towards it. They're all like legs that hold up this table, and on top of the table is right concentration. Now, karma is the thing that determines if we can break the cycle of suffering, and the Buddhist view karma as a naturally occurring thing, right? If you act badly in this life, even if you don't face punishment in this life, you'll face punishment in the next life because you'll be stuck in the cycle of reincarnation. And even though you're a human in this life, you could come back as a cockroach or, snake or something else in a life that is demonstrably worse than being a human, right? By working along the Eightfold Path, we've got to act suitably and develop a virtuous character. So, by doing these things listed in the Eightfold Path, it'll allow us to develop a good character and become virtuous people. We talked a little bit about the Buddhist, and we talked about the Eightfold Path, and we talked about how living in accordance to the Eightfold Path will allow you to be virtuous. Now we're going to move on to Confucian and Taoist virtue ethics. Now, truthfully, both of these systems are different, and they're so different that each of them honestly deserve to have their own video. Our textbook combines them together into one section, which really I think cheapens both of them. So what I've decided to do is I put a little compare and contrast to them to show some ways they're similar, but to also highlight some differences. I do recommend if you find either one of these interesting to do some research on your own. Pick up a copy of the Analects, super cheap, super easy to read, or pick up a copy of the Lao Tzu, super cheap, super easy to read, or a copy of the Mencius, or a copy of the Chuangzi, right? Like any of those, really good, really improve your life. I recommend you read them. Confucius and Lao Tzu lived around 2,500 years ago in ancient China. Confucius himself was a little bit before Lao Tzu, but they were contemporaries, depending on where you look, some people will say that they were both alive at around the same time. Some people will say that Lao Tzu was just was just getting born towards the end of Confucius's life. So there's a little bit of disagreement as to their exact ages and the exact time periods they lived, but they were both alive around 2,500 years ago. They both believed that we needed to be in harmony with nature and the seasons, and they both believe that we have to work towards social harmony and that we both have to follow the way, right? We have to follow that Tao or that Tao, right? We've got to follow that path. However, each of them interpreted that to mean something different, and each of them felt that we needed to move along that path in a different way. Both of them grew up and lived their lives as pantheists, which means, as you probably already know, in ancient China, they had a pantheon of gods, some being local gods, some being ancestors, some being, larger regional gods. They worshipped a variety of these different gods, but they both disagreed on the best way to live a moral life. And their philosophies were really competitors to each other, right? So when you're reading the Analects and you're reading the teachings of Confucius, you got to understand that this is being written for people who are in the court, people who are government workers, or people who are leaders. And it's the same thing for the writings of Lao Tzu, right? This is being written for people that are in charge. It's not being written for the everyday farmer. The teachings of Confucius were expanded by Mencius, and Confucianism actually became the dominant state philosophy of China for about 1900 years until we get the Maoist revolution of the early 1900s, which is pretty wild to think, right? The teachings of Lao Tzu were expanded by Chuangzi, also known as Zhangzhou or Zhangji. All right, so Confucius argued that virtue grew from Li, which is ritual propriety. There are these rituals that society performs, and if we want to be virtuous, we have to follow these rituals. We have to act in the right way at the right time, and we've got to live in accordance with the rules of our time. To us in our modern times, we might think, well, gosh, that's such a bizarre thing. Ritual propriety. We don't have rituals in modern society. Well, we do, but we don't quite call them rituals. Think about the last time you went to a birthday party. Everyone gets together and they sing happy birthday. Or if you're a military member, think of the last time you went to a promotion ceremony. Everyone gets together, they stand at attention. The commander reads off a statement, and then the person walks up on stage and they, affix the new rank to their uniform, right? That's a ritual. And Confucius says that these rituals, they put us in a certain state of mind, they put us in a certain state of being, and they allow us to connect with people in ways that we wouldn't otherwise. And by honoring these rituals and acting appropriately, we can also start to build good habits and live virtuously. So benevolence, also called Ren, is something we got to practice, right? Confucius was very big on being benevolent, being kind, being, helpful and nice to your neighbor. If you see your neighbor in trouble, you need to go and do something nice for them. I don't have this listed, but another thing that Confucius really talks about is that if you want to be a virtuous person, you got to be studying quite a bit. Filial piety, which is honoring your parents, grandparents, elders, that's something else that's very important to Confucius. To Confucius, you could not be a good person if you did not honor your parents, right? And again, to us in our modern times, we might think, well, that seems odd. How quaint, right? How quaint of Confucius. The reason for that is, in Confucius's mind, we learn our virtues and we learn our ethics from our parents. They're the ones that bring us into society. So we have to, one, honor them bringing us into society, but then two, we have to practice that ourselves so that other people around us will see the proper way to act in society. The next thing Confucius talks about is that, we have to be involved in society, right? Like, you can't, according to Confucius, you can't live a good life if you're disconnected from society, which is one of the things that makes him a bit different from the Buddhist, right? So the Buddhists say, like, hey, you can just disconnect, you can pull away. You got to get these detachments. Confucius says, no, you've got to be a part of society. You've got to be a part of your community, and you've got to be helping those people within your community, right? We'll go on to Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu argues that we've got to follow the virtue of Wu Wei. That's effortless action. Now, what does effortless action mean? Because that's something that we don't really hear much in the West. But let me describe it like this. Have you ever been working in your life and you just kind of get in a flow? You just kind of get with the flow, and the next thing you know, hours and hours have passed by, and you have accomplished whatever this thing is you were trying to accomplish. That's Wu Wei. That's effortless action. In the Chuangzi, they use the example of a butcher who's so good at butchering animals that his knife just slides through the meat in effortless strokes. He doesn't even need to sharpen his blade because it's so effortless the way he glides through the meat, right? Or the will maker who's so good at making wills and he's just in that flow. He doesn't need to think about it, right? So how that relates to rulers is the ruler just has to get into that flow of effortless action, not trying to control or exert too much influence, just letting things go and going his own way while still being virtuous. The Taoists argue that we got to step away from human pretenses and arrogance. We got to step away from a lot of these rituals, right? The rituals that were so important to Confucius, we got to pull away from those, and we got to practice these four virtues. We got to practice selflessness, moderation, detachment, and humility. By practicing those things, we can live a good life. The Taoists argue that these things are for all people. All people need to be selfless. All people need to be moderate in the way they live, and all people need to be humble and detached, right? Which again is another difference between the Taoist and the Confucians, right? Confucius says you can't live a good life out of society. The Taoists say you've got to be detached from society, similar to the Buddhists. That leads us into our final topic, which is some of the objections to virtue ethics. Now, some people argue that virtue ethics are too vague and subjective to be useful, that we couldn't make laws from them, or we couldn't come to strong conclusions on how to live our lives. But Aristotle would say that um, the skill of prudence is what allows us to know the proper way to apply virtue ethics. I mean, to me, you know, this first argument seems like a bit of a non-starter because I can't think of many times in my own life where I've been so at a loss for what to do, right? And I think virtue ethics, which is about building morality into habit and building it into practice, is probably a much better way myself to deal with ethical situations than just trying to get these principles from thin air, right? We'll see the utilitarians, or we'll see in Kant, with the deontologists that they just kind of try and pull these principles from thin air. But I myself quite like virtue ethics and think that it's more fitting to human life, and it also allows us to become more virtuous over time, right? It allows us to grow and strengthen our morality. I mean, some people might say, it seems like nonsense that you can grow and become more moral, but we all know people in our lives who, maybe when they were younger, they were really nice, but then they grew up to be really mean and nasty. Or maybe they were really mean and nasty. Maybe they were someone who was addicted to drugs, or maybe they were someone who was, going through some kind of hard situation, but then they have some kind of life changing event, and maybe they're really nice. Maybe they're a pleasant person. Maybe their character has changed. I think that virtue ethics allows us to acknowledge that people can change and grow over time. The next objection is the different cultures have different views on the virtues and what it means to have human flourishing, eudaimonia. Aristotle would say that his virtues and flourishing are universal. Some would disagree. We saw as we were going through here, a bunch of different takes on virtues, a bunch of different takes on what it means to live a good life. My layman's opinion, I think that those aren't such big objections because I didn't see anywhere on here where it said it was a virtue to be mean to people or to be nasty to people. And you know, I have trouble thinking of societies where it's seen as a good thing to, say hurt your family or do mean things to babies, things of that nature, right? So I think that some of those arguments about all these different cultures being different, I think a lot of them are not very well developed. But what do you think? In the comments below, or in the classroom, or during our weekly meeting, let me know what you think on this topic, because I really do want to hear what you have to say. I know this is a bit complicated, and I know the video itself was a long, long video, and I know that there were parts of it that were pretty dry and boring. So if you made it to the end, I really do appreciate it. Some of this stuff, it can seem boring, but that's what philosophy is. In philosophy, you have to have definitions, you have to have terms, and you've got to have these things really laid out in a line, because if you don't, then no one knows what they're talking about, and people are talking about different things. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to talking to you soon.